The Edmonton Oilers are going on a mid-season tear. Nick Zararis is here to talk about why and what it'll take to keep that going in the second half. We've got that and a lot more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets, win or lose on that first $5 bet. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the Monday show a familiar face for Locked On NHL viewers, Nick Zararis of Locked On Oilers. And Nick, the Oilers have been playing some pretty good hockey over the last 15, 20 games. What's been the big difference for this team lately?
They finally got some bounces to go their way. The first month of the season, their penalty kill was the worst in the entire NHL. And if you'll recall, last year in the playoffs, it was perfect. They had one of the best penalty kills in the history of the modern NHL playoff format. So they started getting some bounces. And those stats, save percentage, shooting percentage, and the special teams, they started really poor on all three of those. Before Zach Hyman got hurt in mid-November, he had 3 goals through 20 games, and he's had triple that in the time since he came back to the lineup the first week of December. Nugent Hopkins, Jeff Skinner, Victor Arvidsson, Hyman, who I had just mentioned, all 4 of those guys really weren't doing a whole lot, and it was really whether or not if they scored on the power play that given night was going to decide if they won the game or not, because they weren't generating enough 5-on-5. But since the middle of November, they've started to score a lot more, and that's taken a lot of heat off of their goaltending and their defense, because we can all be frank and objective here. We know the strength of this team is its forward group, and if they're not scoring enough, it's not really realistic to tell Stuart Skinner, Cal Pickard, and that defensive group, hey guys, less than 2 tonight or we're going to lose. It's not feasible in today's NHL.
Yeah, not going to happen all that often. Are they doing something differently besides getting healthy 5-on-5 that has contributed to the offensive improvement?
So first of all, they kind of lucked into Podkolzin really bringing something out of Draisaitl defensively that hasn't really been there at any point in Leon's career. I wouldn't say he was a liability defensively, but never really great in that end. And, Podkolzin started the year on the 4th line, getting 11 minutes a night. He only played 40-something games for Vancouver last year, only had 12 points, something like that, the whole season, and he's well on his way to eclipsing all of those. That's number one. And then number two, they've really tinkered with the lineup a lot, even though they've been successful. They've been juggling guys all over the place, trying to find spots for them, for lack of a better expression. They haven't really found the ideal deployment for Jeff Skinner. I still think their best bet is hoping he can click with McDavid on his left and playing Nugent Hopkins with a combination of Adam Henrique, Connor Brown, or Janmark, whichever 2 of those 3 they'd like to play with Nugent Hopkins, because he hasn't been as defensively reliable or as offensively impactful as in years past. But the most straightforward is Podkolzin's worked really well with Draisaitl. Hyman has played with different places in the lineup. I mean, last week, Hyman was playing with Henrique and Connor Brown, and not Connor Brown. Connor Brown was playing up with McDavid, and Hyman was playing down on the 3rd line. And this is a guy who had 50 goals last year. So they're really trying to find ways to get that supporting cast going. Because if you go and look at the counting stats, once you get past McDavid, Draisaitl, Bouchard, there's a real drop off to that next tier of production. And that's kind of the key to this group is on most nights, Connor, Leon, and the special teams, that's enough. But when you get to later in the season and you get to these important games against good opponents, you need that secondary scoring, because I don't think it's realistic, as we said before, to bank on the defense. And the defense has been a lot better because they're not being asked to be the difference between winning and losing. Something I forgot to mention earlier when you had asked what changed, they're giving Brett Kulak the most minutes he's basically ever played in the NHL. He's gotten a lot of deployment with Darnell Nurse on the second pair. Troy Stetcher has kind of settled into a niche 13, 14 minutes a night type of role. Ty Emberson, they've brought along very slowly, but Brett Kulak's been really instrumental. And the first 15 games or so of the season, Darnell Nurse was on the ice for like half of the goals the Oilers had conceded through the first 15 games. And since then, the minutes have really kind of calmed down. And I think, to be fair to Nurse, injured most of the preseason, didn't play in a single preseason game, and needed that first month or so just to kind of get up to game speed. And through November, it was kind of hazy, but since November 23rd, they have like a 750 points percentage. So everything's kind of leveled out. I don't think they're as good as they've played over the last few weeks, because they're kind of just getting everything to go right in a lot of these games. And that doesn't feel like the best recipe. But when you look at the landscape of what's around them, other than really Vegas, the West is pretty wide open, and there's nobody else that's really in their tier, for lack of a better expression.
Talk to me a little bit about Evander Kane. When will we see him, and how should they handle his return?
That's a great question. I've done 3 separate episodes since the start of the regular season trying to guess that, because it's changed more than once. You know, he came into training camp with the expectation of, I'm going to start the season on time. And then he did his preseason physical, and the lower body, that core injury that had pulled him out of the lineup in the playoffs, was ultimately said, we want to fix this. We'll clean this up. And they said 5 months, which would put him at about February. And he hadn't started doing on-ice stuff. He had just started doing physical therapy in the last few weeks. And then last week, the Oilers said, well, he's got his knee scoped. He had something that was not major, didn't need reconstruction, didn't need to be fixed, but they wanted to scope his knee, get some, I think they said there was something in his knee they wanted to get out of there. And that stops his rehab for the abdominal injury for 4 to 6 weeks, they said. So we're tentatively saying the first week of April if we're combining the 2 timelines, but not sure as far as how those 2 timelines interact with each other. As far as how they handle him, they already have too many forwards. You know, Skinner has been healthy scratched more than once, and this is a guy you signed the first hour free agency opened, and you've yet to really find a spot for him. I don't really have a great answer for what they do with Evander Kane. He wants to play very clearly. I think if he can play, he's definitely one of their 12 best forwards, but they already kind of don't have enough spots in premium parts of the lineup. And you don't want to mess up things that are working. You know, you don't want to take Podkolzin off of Draisaitl's line because that works. You don't want to take Hyman off of McDavid's line for too long. I think Evander Kane ends up getting onto the playoff roster, and they'll end up doing some cap shenanigans where he'll be healthy enough to start the playoffs, but won't have played at all in the regular season. And then I think he's almost certainly traded in the summer for cap reasons, because they can't afford to keep him with the decisions they need to make.
Obviously, we're starting the second half of the season right now. What do you think the Oilers need, and what do you think their goals are between now and the trade deadline?
So as far as their needs, coming into the season, the consensus was clearly another defenseman. I think if you can add a bona fide top 4 guy to play with Nurse, you can play Kulak on the third pair with Emberson. You entirely take Stetcher out of the lineup, and Stetcher's your first guy out of the press box if someone gets hurt. You've got a pretty deep group. You know, you feel reasonably comfortable about that. We all know you probably need 7 or 8 defensemen to get to a cup final just based on the miles and how those games accumulate. They've been talking, Bob Stauffer had mentioned it on the Sportsnet broadcast last week, that they're looking at they want to add a righty, ideally to play with Nurse. They're looking at somebody who kills penalties. They're not particularly inclined for offensive production. Frank Saravelli had said David Savard of that ilk, somebody who's got playoff experience, but it's a little early. We don't know who's out of it yet, which kind of limits who we know is available, because with both conferences as wide open as they are right now, all it takes is a good week and you're right back in the mix, and you don't want to sell if you're right back in the mix.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see in what direction they go, but mostly D, you think, is where they're looking to
100%.
use.
I think unless they were able to trade one of their extra forwards for another forward, if you were able to find a better fit than Jeff Skinner and you could do a player for a player thing, other than that, I think you're almost certainly adding a defenseman. I could understand an argument if you wanted to add a third goalie so you weren't going to Calvin Pickard in the playoffs should something happen, but I think that would be really a luxury to have if you were able to add a third goalie. Defense is that's their biggest need. It was the biggest need opening night. It's their biggest need tonight.
All right, Nick, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
So you can find Locked On Oilers on all the major podcast platforms, on YouTube as well. You can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Nick Zararis, Nick Zararis, and I guess Instagram too. That is my Instagram handle as well. Thanks for having me, Gil.
Hey, thanks for coming by. Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings together everything in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. For me, one of my favorite features is the subscription tracker. I've used it to cancel services I wasn't using anymore, and I've already saved a ton. So cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon.